Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gil Morciano. I'm the new CEO of the Vim Institute. It is a pleasure to welcome you today to our conference on the climate crisis as a foreign policy issue, which will focus on Israeli diplomacy and regional cooperation. First of all, for us regional actors and regional researchers, the topic of climate crisis and the environmental issues as a whole are often mentioned in relations to crisis, mainly as the stuff that wars are made of, from the 1967 war and the role of water security in the eruption of the war, and all the way to the recent civil war in Syria. But the interesting aspect here, when we examine climate crisis as a foreign policy issue, some states would even define it as a matter of national security, is that it always encompasses this unique concept of causing countries to think long-term, to play the long game, to think about, to rise above the immediate consideration, the immediate conflicts, the immediate interest, and to think about the long-term perspective, to think about the quality of life of their citizens, at least theoretically, 10, 20, 40, 50, even 100 years forward, something we rarely do on the regional framework. So it's always about the combination of those two dimensions when we speak about environmental issues in this relation. And, I think I relate to most Israeli speakers here. We spent the last couple of weeks speaking about escalations, about conflict, about risks. And excuse me for the optimism, but when we speak about climate crisis and when we speak about environmental issues, we can identify at least three spaces of opportunity. The first one, really on the most basic level, the renewed commitment of the US administration, of the Biden administration, to climate change. And in combination with the continuous and consistent efforts by the EU, by European actors, to this global new deal, basically, new Green Deal, basically. And I think that we already see the outcomes on the level of new investments, both in renewed energy projects, water security projects, in each and every one of those countries of the region separately. But the real vision, the real challenge is to connect the dots, to create a framework that connects each and every one of those, create a synergy between all those different developments under one regional cooperation framework. We can relate it to as a sustainable regional cooperation on both meanings, both a cooperation that provides and helps improving the quality of life, solving environmental issues in each one of those countries, but also a new basis of long-term cooperation between the countries of the region. And this is a field in which I think our co-host, ECOPIS, have excelled in the last couple of years, decades, I would even say, in trying to build this vision. Now, up until recently, it was mostly an experiment, I think the Abraham Accords really provided us with a valid framework to promote this idea. So when we speak about deepening or improving, even redefining the Abraham Accords, I think climate crisis and environmental issues are an important dimension on that level. Unfortunately, today, our guest from the UAE had to cancel her participation because of personal reasons, but I'm sure that our speakers would relate to the topic of the Abraham Accords in their own contribution. The last layer of optimism, and here I'm being very cautious. I mean, as cautious as you can be with Israeli politics, because it's a change that is evolving as we speak, at the moment. And I'm saying it very cautiously, the formation of the new, or the planned formation of the new government. Now, we don't know, it's too early to call what the ideological outlines of this government are going to be, but at least when it comes to the two important ministries for our topic, the Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Ministry of Regional Cooperation, rumors has it that we are going to see people that are much more committed to regional cooperation, let alone to the two-state solution. That's another very cautious space of optimism. I want to thank our partners in ECOPIS. I think ECOPIS provide us with a model not just on issues of climate crisis, about how to deal with the strategic concept, but also to provide recommendation for practical projects. And I think it's a model for us all as think tanks. The composition of our speakers today is, in fact, a combination between practitioners and thinkers. I would allow the moderators to present them, practitioners and thinkers. That, of course, not to say that our practitioners are not thinkers or that our thinkers are not practitioners, the deal. but I think it's the right combination to deal with the strategic ideas, but also how they influence the reality on the ground in this topic. Last but not least, I want to give a special thank you to our partners from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, without which this event could not have been cannot be materialized, basically. And on that note, I will pass the virtual baton to my colleague and partner, the head of the Israel office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Dr. Paul Pash. So, Dr. Pash, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mociano. Please, let's keep it also in this kind of form by our first names. Gil, thank you very much for your kind words and for your introduction. It is our first joint event, therefore I could not really anticipate what kind of introduction you would give. I will refrain from say my opening words as I had planned, because you already gave such an introduction that we are already in the middle of the discussion. Therefore, I would like to use this opportunity to thank you very much, our friends and colleagues from Mitvim and EcoPeace, for inviting us to join today's so important conference. The number of people that registered are very, very impressive. I hope that many of them do in fact also join us in this conversation today. I would like to use this opportunity also to congratulate Dr. Nimrod Goren for his election as the president of the board of Mitvim, our long-standing strategic partner for so many years. And I would like to say that we hope that the fruitful cooperation that we enjoyed so far will also be continued under your leadership, Gil, jointly with Merav. And also a thank you to the very important contribution that EcoPeace is giving as a pioneer in the field of raising awareness to all the risks of the climate crisis in Israel and the Middle East. I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion today. Thank you very much.
שלום ואחר הצהריים טובים, אני שרון, מנהלת קשרי הממשל של EcoPeace. All the English speakers, please press English on the translation button down here. אז אנחנו נתחיל עכשיו בעצם לתקן שיש לנו קצת שינויים בלוז. הראשון שידבר הוא השגריר דניאל שפירו, דן שפירו. השגריר שפירו הוא חוקר אורח בכיר במכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי. במסגרת פעילותו במכון הוא מתמקד ביחסי ישראל וארצות הברית, יחסי ישראל והפלסטינים, העולם הערבי והחברה הישראלית ועוד. הוא מפרסם לעתים קרובות מאמרים בכתבי עת מובילים, ובמקביל משמש פרשן אורח בכלי תקשורת ישראלים ואמריקנים רבים. לפני הצטרפותו למכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי כיהן כשגריר ארצות הברית בישראל. במסגרת זו לקח חלק במשא ומתן בין ישראלים ופלסטינים, בדיונים בין ארצות הברית וישראל, בנושא עסקת הגרעין ועוד. לפני כן הוא שימש כמנהל מדור המזרח התיכון וצפון אפריקה, במועצה לביטחון לאומי בבית הלבן, והיה חבר בצוותו של השליח המיוחד ג'ורג' מיטשל. הוא יעץ לנשיא אובמה במהלך החודשים הראשונים של המהומות בעולם הערבי ב-2011. מוקדם יותר כיהן במספר תפקידים כיועץ בכיר בקונגרס האמריקני, והוא שימש גם כחבר מן המניין בוועדה ליחסי חוץ. Dan Shapiro, Mr. Shapiro, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me, and I apologize for being a little on the run here and for being a bit out of order. Some emergency circumstances arise, but I really wanted to make sure I could speak. So I will maybe offer a few framing comments for the main presentations that will come later, and then others will add their perspectives in the place I should have spoken. First, just thank you and congratulations to Mitvim and to my friend Gil Mociano, who's assumed the CEO position, to Nimrod Goren. Thank you to Gidon Bromberg and his wonderful team at EcoPeace Middle East. Thank you to Dr. Paul Pash and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for your support for this critical discussion about the climate crisis as a foreign policy matter and the challenges but also opportunities that creates both globally and regionally. And I'll offer, to start, again, a bit out of order, an American perspective that might frame this. It's, of course, just speaking for myself as a researcher at INSS, but I hope it's a perspective that's beneficial for the discussion that will follow. Today, the United States elevates in a way it has not before the climate crisis to one of the most central areas of policy focus on both the domestic and the foreign policy fronts. It's been a common thread all this year through appointments and policy initiatives in the economic, infrastructure, racial justice, and national security policy spheres. And importantly, in addition to being a priority in its own right, obviously saving the planet and saving humanity from a brutal warming future, what I've seen is an attempt to identify ways that working to address the climate crisis reinforces other foreign policy priorities, and I'll mention several of them. First, we've heard a lot about working to break down the traditional lines that separate foreign and domestic policy, and to prioritize foreign policies that benefit the American middle class. That perspective often focuses on job creation through innovation, and we've heard an enormous focus on technology innovation that will help produce products and approaches and technologies that are going to be part of the solutions to the climate crisis. So that's what I think this translates into, an aspiration on the part of the United States to lead the world in developing innovative technologies that decrease our overall dependence on fossil fuels, that create export-driven jobs that improve Americans' lives, and of course that address the climate crisis worldwide. A second priority, I think, is we've heard a renewed emphasis on the idea that major transnational problems can best be addressed by U.S. leadership and multilateral diplomacy. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is the most pressing and current example. The refugee crisis that predated COVID is another. But clearly, the climate crisis is high on that list. And so the return of the United States to the Paris Climate Accords earlier this year, and the subsequent efforts that we're already seeing by the United States to lead countries to accelerate their meeting and even exceeding their Paris targets, and then even looking beyond what Paris requires, are really emblematic of this connection. Third, even in an era of strategic competition between great powers, something that's now, I think, acknowledged to be an important framing principle of U.S. foreign policy, the climate crisis is identified as an area where the United States may be able to cooperate even with its global strategic competitors, China and Russia. And while many, many other aspects of those relationships may be competitive, even more than competitive and sources of tension, the climate crisis is one area that may make those relationships something other than zero-sum rivalries. And finally, I think we're seeing a renewed emphasis on the idea that addressing climate-driven crises like water scarcity and food insecurity can also help mitigate conflicts, reduce mass migration, reinforce regional and local stability, and deprive extremists of fertile recruiting environments. These touch on some of the themes that Gil Murciano mentioned in his remarks. So how does this all play out in the Middle East? The Middle East offers opportunities to advance several of these priorities. Innovative technologies that are being developed in Israel, and now increasingly in collaboration with its new partners from the Abraham Accords through investment and joint ventures, can be a very potent contributor to addressing the broader climate challenge. And so as a supporter of regional efforts to address climate-driven challenges and mitigate their effects, U.S. diplomacy can connect those initiatives, those technology initiatives, to the broader transnational undertakings that the U.S. is trying to lead on. Alleviating water scarcity and other resource challenges that derive from the climate crisis can, of course, decrease the intensity of local conflicts and even give rise to shared solutions that benefit erstwhile adversaries. In that regard, the Blue-Green New Deal that Gidon will present later, that EcoPeace Middle East has been working on and leading on for so many months, really proposes very significant opportunities to make progress on innovative technology development to address these climate-driven challenges, to broaden the benefits of normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors to include other actors like Jordan and the Palestinians, to improve intercommunal ties between Israelis, both Jewish and Arab, and between Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, and others, in ways that support broader climate conflict mitigation efforts. And that can be combined from the U.S. side with the soon-to-be established Nita Lowey Middle East Peace Partnership Fund, to which many other countries can add their contributions to the $50 million a year for 5 years that the Congress has already appropriated. This is a program that will create excellent opportunities to promote grassroots level initiatives that reinforce national level commitments to addressing water scarcity and other climate-driven effects in ways that build intercommunal ties, improve those environmental conditions, and support broader efforts to address regional conflicts. So while these remarks would have been, I think, more logical, having heard the presentations that are about to follow, I hope they will still resonate as the framing that at least one observer and researcher of American foreign policy has taken note of about not just the challenge, but the real opportunities that are before us as climate emerges as one of the primary drivers of foreign policy strategy in the years ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shapiro. תודה רבה על הדברים החשובים ועל שיתוף הפעולה ארוך השנים שאנחנו מקיימים ביחד. אני רוצה להציג עכשיו את השגרירה ג'אנט ווגן. שגרירה מונתה לתפקידה כשגרירת בריטניה למזרח התיכון וצפון אפריקה, מזרח אירופה ומרכז אסיה במרץ 2021. השגרירה הצטרפה לשירות החוץ הבריטי בשנת 86. בתפקידיה הקודמים שירתה במזרח הרחוק, בבלקן, במזרח התיכון ובאפריקה, ואף עבדה בנאט"ו ובאו"ם. יש לה ניסיון רב בתחום המדיניות, עולמות הפיתוח ובסוגיות הומניטריות באזורי קונפליקט. השגרירה עוסקת רבות ועלה על סדר היום פיתוח בר קיימא, שינוי האקלים העולמיים והסכמים אסטרטגיים כדוגמת COP26. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and shalom to all of our participants and listeners. I was actually also posted in Tel Aviv back in 2005 to 2008, but I'm afraid my Hebrew has long since left me, so you'll have to listen to me in English. I was asked today, and I'm very, very happy to join this panel to talk a little bit about climate change and international diplomacy. And I wanted to start off by taking a slightly broader look and trying to understand why climate change has become the issue that it has, both in terms of driving policy, but as a global crisis and as something which all of our communities have to address. As humans, we exist in families, communities, societies, nations on the surface of a planet that is also occupied by a myriad forms of life. Peace and conflict are two extremes of human existence, and diplomacy and war are the ways we pursue those policies, the names we call the ways we pursue those policies. Most of the time, most of us live somewhere in the middle of that. We're not at one extreme or the other, and most of us yearn for peace. But changes in circumstances can drive us towards conflict. Essentially, conflict arises from imbalance, inequality, exclusion, from resources, from political discourse, from economic and social opportunity. Let me take energy as an example. We all need energy for everyday life and for increased human development. Think how much energy we are using just for today's webinar. We are all dependent ultimately on the sun for our sources of energy, whether we are clever humans using solar panels or clever plants photosynthesizing, or possibly less clever humans burning carbon-based fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, or wood even, which releases the energy from the sun stored in those clever plants millennia ago. And I say less clever because one of the unintended consequences of burning fossil fuels is the waste products that damage our atmosphere, leaving it even more open to the sun's rays and thus warming the planet, which has an impact on our weather systems and our rainfall patterns, and which can lead to increasing numbers of extreme weather events, whether droughts or desertification or floods. So all of these basic things we need for our everyday life and the ability to improve our human development status are around us, but are constantly something which we are battling to have access to. We need food, we need water, we need to be educated, we need to be healthy. The COVID crisis is showing what happens globally when we are not able to be healthy. It has an impact on our social and economic status. We need trade, natural resources, raw or processed. We exploit the land through mining, farming, forestry, and we exploit the sea through extraction of minerals and fishing. We leave behind us, in doing all of this, a trail of waste and pollution as byproducts of our human needs. And this affects the balance for other inhabitants of the planet as well as ourselves. So this entire picture of human activity, which some now are calling the age of the Anthropocene, the age in which the human population is having a greater impact on the planet than the planet is having on us, threatens our social stability and economic growth because it threatens our access to all of the elements needed to satisfy our everyday needs and to improve our human development status. This region that we're in now is the most water scarce region in the world. It is prone to increasing desertification. Its coastlines are liable to erosion. Its seas and its shores to pollution. There are even reports of single-use masks used in the response to COVID-19 already washing up on beaches in the region, a global health crisis contributing to a global climate and environmental crisis. It's a sort of vicious cycle. So you might wonder, when am I ever going to get to the topic you asked me to speak about, the climate crisis and international diplomacy? So diplomacy is just the means by which nations seek to engage each other in peaceful pursuit of their interests or to address something that is damaging their interests. Following Brexit, for example, the UK is engaging in intensive diplomacy to negotiate trade agreements around the world. Actual agreement will depend on finding a fair balance that suits both sides. The current skirmishing in the English Channel over fishing rights reminds us that competition over resources can be conflictual even while diplomatic negotiations continue. And to lay it on even heavier, I'm going to use Clausewitz a bit freely to make a link between conflict or diplomacy and climate for us. Clausewitz likened war to a chameleon whose nature is made up of three elements, the interplay of which determines its response to any particular threat. First, blind instinct, the passions stirred up by triggers or root causes of conflict. Here, when we're talking about climate, we've already identified them: energy, water, food security, erosion of land and coastal and other elements. Second, what Clausewitz called the play of probabilities and chance. I would call it the circumstances in which the conflict happens to be occurring and the means of implementation. In the case of conflict, military might or technology. When we talk about battling climate change, we again are talking about technology and our will to be able to do something. And the third element Clausewitz said was playing in this was reason, the drive of policy. What are our leaders deciding? So let me leave the theory for a minute and turn to COP26, the Conference of Parties, the 26th in this series, which is a major diplomatic effort to address our shared concerns about climate change. The Paris Agreement, on which this is based, was set up in 2015, that COP21. 5 years ago, in theory, we had to defer for a year because of COVID. The same year, we also agreed the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is an agenda for improving human development for all countries in the world, not just the developing world. We also, the same year, had the Sendai framework on disaster risk and reduction as a response to the terrible increasing natural disasters that have been happening and affecting communities that are not ready for them and haven't built resilience. All of these happened in the same year for a reason, because as the international community, we were looking at how to address all of those issues together. And that's really what international diplomacy is about. So 5 years on, we have a moment of checkpoint. We have a moment when we're all coming together to say, how well have we done in what we've set out to do in 2015, and what more do we need to do as we head onwards towards the ultimate goals in these areas? There are 4 real areas that we need to look at, and they go back and they really link across to Clausewitz's chameleon. The first one is mitigation, the so-called element about how do we stop global warming. We said back in Paris we were going to try to hold it under 2 degrees with a target of 1.5 degrees. Science is currently telling us that globally what we've done is going to be nowhere near that. We're almost double. Even if we fully implemented everything that we said we were going to do, and we're nowhere near that. So we need to increase our levels of ambition as we go forward. On mitigation, we need to do more. We need to be stopping the burning of fossil fuels. Coal is obsolete. Coal has to be the past. Even gas is a kind of transitional measure towards renewable technologies, which are going to take us into an area where we've reduced those emissions, we've reduced the global warming, we've reduced that impact on us. Adaptation is the second goal. Adaptation is really the way that we can say the climate has already changed. How are we going to live our lives and develop our economies in ways that don't make those tendencies even worse? So are we sharing technologies? Are we understanding the needs of our people and how we can drive forward into new areas, allowing development, not turning people back, but doing it in a clean way? How are we using our agriculture? Are we having climate resilient methods of agriculture? Are we using sustainable fishing? Are we extracting natural resources in ways that preserve the possibilities for the future? The third goal is means of implementation, very broadly, especially finance. We pledged at Paris that the developed countries would raise $100 billion a year for the developing world to make that leap forward, so that they can be both addressing the issues of climate, but also moving forward on social and economic development. We are still far from that. We haven't managed to do that. And we also recognize that it cannot only be government money alone that does this. The private sector has a massive role to play, because it's also where innovation comes from. It's where these new technologies come from. It's where new green jobs are created. The role of governments is to set the targets and provide the right regulation and legislation, and to enable the private sector really to come on board and take that forward. And the fourth means, and it comes along with that, is collaboration. How do we work together in a coordinated way for each element doing the thing that is required by it in order to change? That means bringing in communities. It means being inclusive, not exclusive, going back to my root causes of conflict. And it means listening to the most vulnerable and most least resilient parts of the community, whether that is on a gender basis, that we make sure we're including women and girls who are often the most vulnerable and the most impacted by climate change, in listening to indigenous peoples who often have very much better traditional ways of managing natural resources that we have ignored over recent centuries. And ensuring that everybody has an equal voice in this. And as the COP presidency for this COP, the UK is really trying to reach out and make sure that every party to the COP, every country, in other words, who is a signatory to it, but also all of the other non-parties who are interested, the private sector, civil society, this very interesting proposal that we're hearing about today, are part of the debate. Because at the end of the day, climate-related root causes of conflict, which are not the sole causes of conflict, there's very rarely one sole cause of conflict, are all issues on which we can feel very strongly, but we have the ability to change. We can make policy changes on the basis of both our shared interest and our national interest. We can make different financial investments for our own interests and for our shared interests. We can understand that global warming doesn't respect boundaries. It affects all of us. And therefore, the only way that we can resolve this element of the chameleon is to come back and do it together. So really, when we talk about COP26 and we say this is a very important, very significant conference, it's because even 5 years on from Paris, when we agreed all of those things, we haven't made enough progress. So we need to make more progress. As we go forward, as we look towards net zero on emissions and on global warming by the middle of the century, we have to say, what does that practically mean in every case? And if we don't deal with those things, then the pressures of our communities and on individuals to get those things that they need for their everyday life, the water, the food, the agriculture, the economic means to survive, are going to be the drivers of conflict even more than they already are. So the importance of COP26 is really huge as we look to see the consequences of COVID and the consequences of climate coming together at the same time. We look for policies that will take us forward into a green, resilient recovery. And that's essentially where all of our governments are trying to position ourselves in terms of our best national interests, but also in terms of the interests of the planet globally. I think probably for the first time ever, this is the attempt to bring together both national interests and real international action for an outside impact that affects all of us. Let me stop there and let the debate open up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for the important words. תודה רבה על הדגשת הנקודות החשובות ועל הצורך בשיתוף פעולה אזורי ובינלאומי. אני רוצה עכשיו להציג את דוקטור רועי קיבריק, מנהל המחקרים של מכון מתווים. תחומי המומחיות שלו כוללים בין היתר את הסכסוך והמשא ומתן הישראלי-פלסטיני, תיאוריות של יחסים בינלאומיים, מחשבה פוליטית, פסיכולוגיה פוליטית ועוד. רועי שימש כעמית מחקר במכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי בתל אביב, עמית מחקר במכון דייוויס ליחסים בינלאומיים באוניברסיטה העברית בירושלים, וחוקר אורח בקינגס קולג' בלונדון. רועי, בבקשה.
שלום לכולם. אני אדבר על משבר האקלים ומדיניות החוץ של ישראל. ואני אפתח במסר המרכזי שלי, שבא קצת לצנן אולי מהאופטימיות של גיל מפתיחת המפגש, אני גם אשאיר בסוף קצת מקום לאופטימיות, אבל בינתיים חשוב להגיד ולפתוח בזה שמשבר האקלים לא מהווה סוגיה חשובה בישראל. לא במדיניות הפנים וגם לא במדיניות החוץ. זה נכון שיש לאחרונה כמה שינויים שמעניקים לסוגיה הזאת משקל קצת יותר גדול, ביחסי החוץ של ישראל, בחשיבות שישראל מעניקה לסוגיה הזאת, אבל הקצב הוא לא מספק. וההבנה שהסוגיה הזאת, דווקא הסוגיה הזאת, יכולה לשרת, כמו שדן אמר קודם לכן, יכולה לשרת בצורה המיטבית גם שאר המטרות והיעדים של מדיניות החוץ הישראלית, היא לא מתבססת, היא לא קונה לה אחיזה, ונוכח ההזדמנויות הרבות שהיא דווקא מעניקה, מדובר בפספוס גדול שחובה עלינו לתקן. אז אני אתחיל. ואני מתחיל קודם כל בעובדה שאקלים היא סוגיה של מדיניות חוץ. אנחנו מתחילים בנקודה שאולי ברורה לכל מי שנמצא כאן משותף לכנס, אבל חשוב להניח אותה, כי הבסיס לקיום הדיאלוג בינינו, ולהבנה של התחום, ולתביעה שלנו ממדיניות החוץ של ישראל, לעסוק במשבר האקלים. אקלים היא סוגיה של מדיניות חוץ. גם, לא רק, גם. יותר מכך, אפשר אפילו לטעון, כמו שניסחו את זה במרכז ווילסון רק לפני כמה חודשים, שהיום מדיניות חוץ היא מדיניות אקלים. ואם אני אנסה לתרגם את זה לשפה ברורה ופשוטה, משבר האקלים הוא לא עוד נושא שצריך לטפל בו. משבר האקלים הוא אחד ממרכיבי הבסיס של המציאות שבה אנחנו חיים. המציאות שאיתה אנחנו צריכים להתמודד, שאותה אנחנו צריכים להבין, ובא עלינו לנסח את המדיניות ולהוציא אותה אל הפועל. ולכן יש ציפייה ממדיניות החוץ הישראלית, שתקדיש משאבים לטיפול במשבר האקלים. אז מה מקום האקלים במדיניות החוץ הישראלית? את האמת, או לא כל כך האמת, אבל בגדול אין מקום לאקלים במדיניות החוץ הישראלית. נכון, זאת הכללה גסה, וזאת אמירה קשה, והיא לא מדויקת, ותסלחו לי רגע על הדמגוגיה והסטייה מהדיוק המחקרי, ובהמשך גם ידבר השליח המיוחד למשבר האקלים במשרד החוץ, ידידי היקר, השגריר מר גדעון בכר, הוא יציג בכל זאת שמשרד החוץ עושה משהו בתחום, אבל
כשאנחנו בוחנים את ספר תוכניות העבודה של הממשלה, של משרד החוץ, משבר האקלים לא נמצא שם. גם לא כשבוחנים את השקעת המשאבים ואת ביצוע התוכניות של הממשלה. אז נכון, יש התייחסות קצרה אצל משרד האנרגיה, בצורך לפתח מקורות אנרגיה מתחדשים, בהתאם להחלטת ממשלה, וגם זה בלי התייחסות מקיפה למשבר האקלים. במשרד החוץ אין שום מילה על משבר האקלים. זה לא שישראל מתכחשת למשבר האקלים, לא זה העניין. ישראל מיישרת קו עם הקהילה הבינלאומית, מתנהגת כמי שעושה את מה שצריך לעשות. אולי אבל רק כדי לצאת ידי חובה. תראו, היא משתתפת בכינוסים העולמיים, היא תגיע לקופ 26. היא מתכוננת לקראת הכינוסים. הממשלה מחליטה על יעדים לצמצום פליטת גזי חממה. הנושא עולה מדי פעם במפגשים בין ישראל לבין מדינות האזור, ושחקנים בינלאומיים אחרים. הכל באופן סביר. אבל מהמדינה שאוהבת לראות בעצמה פורצת דרך, וחדשנית, ויוזמת, מובילה, משמעותית בעולם, לא זאת בדיוק ההתנהגות שהיינו רוצים ומצפים. לא בנושא שהוא כל כך מרכזי ומשמעותי. לא בנושא שמרכיב את העולם, כמו שאנחנו פוגשים אותו היום. אז באופן כללי אין התנגדות בישראל לשיתופי פעולה בתחום האקלים. אבל זה רחוק מאוד מלהיות הסוגיה העקרונית שמנחה ומעצבת את מדיניות החוץ הישראלית. נושא האקלים נתפס כמרכיב נחמד אם קיים, שלא ניתן להתעלם ממנו לחלוטין, אבל הוא לא מרכזי ולא הכרחי. ולבסוף, וכתוצאה מכך אנחנו רואים, מדינת ישראל גם לא עומדת ביעדים שהיא בעצמה מציבה לעצמה, ומתחייבת אליהם בפני הקהילה הבינלאומית, והנה, התפרסם על כך רק לפני יומיים, אני חושב. עכשיו, יש כמה סיבות שניתן להציע כהסבר למה. למה זה לא נמצא במרכז השיח והפעולה הישראלית. ראשית, המבנה הפוליטי הישראלי לא מעודד תכנון ארוך טווח, ולקיחת אחריות לטווח רחוק. הצורך לגזור קופונים פוליטיים מיידיים, עוד בקדנציה שלך, מכתיב במידה רבה את ההחלטות ואת העבודה הממשלתית, בטח ובטח כאשר הסדרה המקצועית של בכל המשרדים, כמעט, מוחלשת. שנית, המבנה הכלכלי, בטח יחד עם גילוי הגז בים התיכון, גם זה הוזכר כאן, גם הוא מוטה לגזירת רווחים מיידיים, ושימוש יתר במשאבים קיימים. רעיון הצמיחה עדיין מניע את הכלכלה הישראלית, לא רעיון הכלכלה המעגלית, או הכלכלה הכחולה ירוקה, כמו שידידי היקר גדעון, בטח ברומברג יתייחס לכך בהמשך. אנחנו עדיין בגדול משק ניאו-ליברלי בערכיו, בתפיסותיו, כן עם שאריות סוציאליסטיות מפעם. שלישית, השיח הביטחוני הישראלי, נוטה לבחון את המציאות דרך העיניים הצבאיות. אנחנו צריכים לזכור את זה, אנחנו חיים את זה. אז הוא נכנס לתוך המשקפת ומסתכל על האיומים המיידיים, אבל מפספס את התמונה הכללית הגדולה של האיום החמור יותר. ומושג הביטחון הישראלי הוא מושג הביטחון הלאומי צבאי, ואין שם מקום לאיום של משבר האקלים, אלא כמשתנה רקע, שיכול אולי להצמיח איומים צבאיים, או להעצים איומים קיימים. רביעית, סיבה נוספת, משבר האקלים סובל באופן עולמי מההטיה האנושית להתמודד עם האיומים הקרובים והמיידיים, לפני שמתמודדים עם האיומים הרחוקים יותר, גם אם הם משמעותיים יותר. כלומר, דחיינות והדחקה זאת לא המצאה ישראלית, שני מנגנונים שעובדים מצוין בכל העולם וגם אצלנו. וחמישית, אולי האתגר שבוא איתו, גם לנו צריכה להיות תרומה להתמודד איתו, האתגר לקשור בין משבר האקלים לחיי היום-יום שלנו הוא לא פשוט. זאת אומרת, זה לא קל להמחיש את האיום ולחוות אותו באופן מיידי, גם בגלל שהשינויים הם הדרגתיים, אינקרמנטליים, קיים אתגר לקשור את מגוון התופעות, מגוון האסונות שכבר מתחוללים אצלנו, למשבר האקלים באופן כללי. לייצר את הקישור הרגשי והתבוני שנחוץ כדי לגייס תמיכה ציבורית ופוליטית ולהפנות משאבים לנושא. אז יש כאן אתגר משותף של ביסוס קונצנזוס לגבי הידע שקושר בין משבר האקלים למגוון רחב של תופעות. טוב, אז יש לנו סיבות למה לא, אבל אנחנו כמובן לא ניכנע לסיבות האלו ולהסברים הללו, ואנחנו צריכים להצביע על ההכרח שבהתייחסות למשבר האקלים, ועל ההזדמנויות שתמונות בהפיכת מדיניות החוץ הישראלית למדיניות אקלים. וקודם כל אין לנו הרבה ברירה, המציאות הפיזית משתנה ולמשבר האקלים יש כוח שכנוע משל עצמו. ההשלכות של משבר האקלים הופכות חמורות יותר, המציאות מכריחה את ישראל ואת התושבים באזור בכלל להפנות תשומת לב ומשאבים להתייחסות לנושא. לכן הטיפול במשבר האקלים הוא הוא מטרה מרכזית בפני עצמו, אולי המטרה. ולכן באמת תשומת הלב לאט לאט הולכת וגדלה גם בתוך המציאות הישראלית. שנית, משבר האקלים מביא גם לשינויים במבנה ובשיח העולמי, וזה הזכיר גם דן שפירו קודם. וישראל לא יכולה להתעלם מכך. הסביבה הבינלאומית משתנה. הממשל בארצות הברית משתנה. מעניק לנושא הזה משקל גבוה. אז אם ישראל רוצה להיות חלק מהעולם, וכמו שהיא כותבת בספר תוכניות העבודה שלה, להבטיח את מעמדה הבינלאומי, לשמר את יחסיה עם ארצות הברית, אלה חלק מהיעדים. יהיה עליה לאמץ את השיח ואת הנושא לליבה, ולהוכיח שהיא רצינית בהתייחסות לסוגיה הזאת. וזה לא רק ארצות הברית, זה בקרב כל השחקנים האחרים, הזכרתם את זה קודם, מדינות, מוסדות, עסקים, חברה אזרחית, המודעות הסביבתית גוברת, ואם ישראל רוצה להיות חלק מהעולם, היא צריכה להכיר שזה העולם החדש. ושלישית, ההתמודדות עם משבר האקלים מזמנת עבור מדיניות החוץ הישראלית אין סוף של אפשרויות טובות. בסדר, גם לנקודה הזאת, כשדן שפירו פתח ואמר, אני רוצה למסגר את הדיון, אני מתחבר לזה. יש אין סוף הזדמנויות טובות שיכולות לשרת את ישראל, ההתייחסות למשבר האקלים, גם בהתמודדות טובה יותר עם השגת מטרות ויעדים אחרים. זהו החלק האחרון של הדברים שלי, אולי המרכזי שבהם. מדיניות חוץ ישראלית שמכוונת אקלים ומתבססת אקלים, יכולה להגשים עוד מטרות. למה? כי היא מחייבת יצירת שותפויות אזוריות, שחוצות גבולות פוליטיים, ובנייה של יציבות פוליטית. כי צריך, בין היתר, כמו שהזכירו קודם, להפיק אנרגיה, לחלוק, להעביר אותה, ואי אפשר לבד, את זה עושים במשותף. כי ביטחון המזון תלוי בשיתופי פעולה של מספר מדינות. כי תרומה ישראלית של היכולות המדעיות והטכנולוגיות שלה, למאמצים המשותפים, גם באזור וגם בעולם, תביא גם לשיפור במעמד שלה, בנכסיות של ישראל, בדיוק בהתאם למטרות של הממשלה. כי מדיניות כזאת היא מחייבת חתירה לשלום, לבניית חיי שלום ושיתופי פעולה, כי היא מחייבת את החיזוק של הדמוקרטיה. במהותה המרכזית של הדמוקרטיה, שבה האדם לוקח אחריות על גורלו, ומתנהל בשותפות עם החברים שלו, לקדם אינטרסים משותפים, בשקיפות, ובפתרון קונפליקטים ללא אלימות. ומדיניות שכזו מחייבת צמצום פערים כלכליים וחברתיים, במרחב בכלל, בין פרטים, בין קהילות, כי זאת הדרך לייצר חוסן רב יותר, להתמודד טוב יותר עם משבר האקלים, ועם ההשלכות שלו. אז אני לא אכנס לכל הרעיונות והפרויקטים שעומדים על הפרק היום, או אלה שיכולים לעמוד על הפרק. יהיה איזה חיבור רשתות החשמל בין אירופה ואסיה, יהיו אלה הסכמים משותפים למדינות האזור שכוללים סחר בעודפי אנרגיה מתחדשת ומים, יהיו אלה שיתופי פעולה כלכליים להפקת חלבון מהים, או שיתופי פעולה פוליטיים לקידום מערכות בריאות עמידות יותר, או הקמת כוחות אזוריים משותפים לתגובה והתמודדות עם אסונות ומקרי קיצון. אפשר, אם תרצו, נוכל להמשיך ולפרט ולרדת לכל רעיון כזה או אחר, אבל עקרונות המנחים הם מה שחשובים. והפיכת מדיניות החוץ הישראלית למדיניות אקלים היא בראש ובראשונה המטרה המרכזית, כדי להבטיח חיים טובים, אבל גם האמצעי, דרכו ניתן להשיג מטרות נוספות לבניית חיים טובים, שיתופי פעולה אזוריים ובינלאומיים וחיי שלום. תודה. מיקרופון אליכם.
Thank you, Roy. And I'm taking over the moderation of the next part of our conference. My name is Nimrod Goren. I'm president of the Vim Institute, and of course would like to join all the greetings and welcoming said before, and thank EcoPeace and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for our cooperation, and welcome Gil on board as our new CEO. Yes, you know, you already heard about how much environment and climate change provides a challenge, but also poses an opportunity, especially for regional cooperation and for transforming diplomacy. And the next speaker, Gideon Bromberg from EcoPeace, will provide us with a great example of how this crisis could leverage a regional cooperation between Israel and its immediate neighbors, the Palestinians and the Jordanians. Gideon is the co-founder and the Israel director of EcoPeace. He's been doing this job for more than 25 years. Has been appearing on the major stages all around the world, from the Security Council to the European Parliament to Congress, advancing issues relating to energy, to environment, to water, with a clear focus on transforming the Israeli discourse and policy making, but also doing that together with our neighbors. So Gideon, please present what EcoPeace has come up with to tackle the climate change.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. I also want to congratulate both Mitvim and your new CEO and president, and grateful for the support of also the foundation. This is a critical issue that is generally seen as an issue that is presented as a threat multiplier, where the climate crisis facing the world is seen as a further issue of instability. And at EcoPeace Middle East, we think that indeed that's the case, but diplomacy and regional diplomacy can turn things around and can actually create from a threat multiplier to a multiplier of opportunities. And I think that's what EcoPeace has, in all of its work over the 26 years, has tried to focus on. And the brief presentation that I'm about to give is based on a new report calling for a green-blue deal for the Middle East. It's really inspired by Europe's effort of a green deal, a European green deal, that is at the moment the most sophisticated, holistic approach I think that any region of the world has so far presented. But it's also equally inspired by the new efforts of the US administration, the Biden administration, that has really put onto the center stage as well a new US commitment to fight climate change. When we look at the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa region, we are already the most water scarce part of the world. There is no other area of the world that is as water scarce, sadly, as our region. Our region is also presently a hotspot of conflict. And although there's no direct relationship, there is an indirect relationship between water insecurity and many of the conflicts that we see all over our region, all over North Africa and the Middle East. When we see the models as presented by research institutes, and the model, the data that I'm presenting here is actually cooperative research by German and Israeli universities, we have good reason to show great alarm. When we look at what will happen by the middle of this century, we will no longer see rainfall during the autumn months, while the rest of the world is so rightly fearful of 1.5 degree increase in temperature. For the most part, we're already experiencing a 1 degree average increase in temperature, and we can expect, the models are telling us that we can expect a 4 degree increase in temperature. And that's why the IPCC has identified the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean as a climate hotspot. By the end of the century, the bottom graph is actually showing us that we're going to have a 50% increase in our summer months. When we think of already experiencing long summer months here, by the end of the century, large areas of our region will basically not be livable if we don't turn around, if we don't meet the challenge that Paris and our Glasgow presents the world. We will suffer perhaps more than any other area in this planet. And it's on that basis that at EcoPeace Middle East we've put very concretely 4 proposals on the table. We're not trying to be as comprehensive as the European Union, of course, but we're putting on the table 4 proposals that we believe require the urgent attention of our own governments, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian, and the international community. And in fact, the first proposal on the table has actually received the attention of the G7, and we hope that this proposal will in fact be adopted by the G7 in their meeting next week. And this is, as Ambassador Janet Rogan had suggested earlier, a proposal that is really bringing forth both climate mitigation efforts and climate adaptation efforts, but also an entry point for regional cooperation and peace building through the climate lens. And what our study here revealed, utilizing experts from our three countries, but also from the international community, that Jordan really has the comparative advantage in our region to produce large-scale renewable energy, not only for her own purposes, but also for the purposes of selling renewable energy to both the Israeli and Palestinian electricity grids. On the other hand, the Mediterranean coast of Israel and Gaza hold the comparative advantage of producing additional water, which under the climate crisis is so much more needed, also at cheapest prices for the purposes of Israeli and Palestinian needs, but also as a means to sell the needed water for Jordan. And Israel and the Gaza Strip can produce that water at cheapest prices, cheaper than anything that Jordan can produce on her side, simply because of the distance between Aqaba and Jordan's major population centers. Israel appears to have large desert areas, but in fact the Negev is captured. It's half of the Negev is military training, the other half are declared nature reserves. And here I would differ a little bit with Roy. We see some tremendous changes in policies by the government of Israel, and particularly by the Ministry of Energy and the Water Authority. The Ministry of Energy has really come to understand, to see that as Israel's increased its commitments to meet the climate challenge, it can no longer meet that challenge of 30% renewables by 2030, relying on its own territory. And the Minister of Energy and the Ministry of Energy have now publicly declared a desire to purchase electricity for the very first time from a neighbor, be it Jordan, be it Egypt. We strongly believe that Jordan presents that opportunity, and we as practitioners have played a proactive role in, again, something that Ambassador Rogan had mentioned earlier, to involve also the private sector. And here we've approached very large potential investors from the Emirates to invest in Jordan, not only for Jordan's renewable energy abilities, but also to sell that electricity across the border. And we've seen tremendous interest from the Gulf states to do that. And I think that also speaks to then the additional opportunity that was also mentioned by Ambassador Dan Shapiro, who highlighted the importance of the Abraham Accords. Well, here we have the opportunity, because of the climate crisis, to not only advance the Abraham Accords through investments from the Emirates, but to include Jordan and Palestine and the Palestinian Authority in this effort to meet the challenge of climate mitigation and the investments in solar in Jordan for the purposes of sale to the Israeli and Palestinian energy markets. Similarly, on the waterfront, we know that the Israeli Water Authority is extremely concerned about the dire water situation, particularly in Jordan, and there's a growing understanding that water instability that continues to grow in Jordan because of the climate crisis, because of the Syrian refugees, threatens Jordan's national stability, which threatens Israel's national security. So there's also a strong desire, and we've seen that by $1 billion shekel investment of the Israeli Water Authority to reverse the national water carrier, which means bringing desalinated water from Israel to the Sea of Galilee to both protect the Sea of Galilee from the impacts of climate change, but also to create the ability to sell additional water as needed to Jordan. And through this example, we can create region-wide water security, region-wide energy security through renewable energy. And for the very first time, each side, each party has something to sell and something to buy. And therefore, we think that that is a very important way to create stability for our region. And again, it's built from our research on the experience of Europe, because Europe too has known hundreds of years of violence and hatred, but one of the changes that took place after World War II was the coal and steel agreement, which aimed to utilize the two most important natural resources of the continent, of the European continent, relevant at that time, coal and steel, and force integration. Well, we have the opportunity, because of the climate crisis, to harness the sun, which we're blessed with, and harness the sea, which, much due to Israel's leadership in technology, we can now also harness, and then create that healthy interdependence and resulting in stability. A second chapter that I want to focus on is climate resilience, particularly in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and highlight that there's a need to move forward on a fair share of water resource sharing between Israelis and Palestinians, because facing the climate crisis, we're going to see greater and greater instability, both in throughout Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza, if we fail to do so. And therefore, the climate crisis also, in this way, presents the opportunity to also advance the peace process and to advance the two-state solution that we're extremely committed to as an organization, and believe that is the only solution to the conflict that will bring real peace and prosperity to our region. And here we have to understand that when the Oslo Accords were negotiated back in 1994, 1995, it made sense to hold water back as a final status issue, because at that time there was only natural water available, the groundwater of the coastal aquifer, the mountain aquifer, or the Jordan River system, and reaching a final agreement on water would have produced winners and losers. It would have moved more water to the Palestinian side, and the Israeli side wouldn't have had something to replace that water loss. Well, that's no longer relevant today, and it's much due to Israel's leadership in the water technology, both as the global leader in treating sewage and then reusing it for agriculture, and then combined also with a massive increase in desalination at extremely affordable prices. So back in 94, 95, desalination really wasn't the option because it cost $2 a cubic meter to desalinate. Today, the cost of desalination is down to 44 cents and dropping. And that today presents the opportunity to move forward on Israeli-Palestinian water discussions in a manner that can advance the peace process by solving one of the final status issues, resulting in more water in every home, so that we don't, these are the 5 desalination plants that currently exist on the Israeli coast. 70% of Israel's drinking water is coming today from desalination rather than natural water, with some really significant plans to increase that desalination, and also plans on the Gaza coast, which also desperately needs that additional water. We must stop seeing this type of reality that we currently see, whether it's in Gaza, where 2 million people can no longer drink the groundwater because it's too polluted and too saline, and they're dependent on filling jerry cans from small desalination plants, or intermittent water supply that we see throughout the West Bank. There's no reason to hold, as we would describe, water issues hostage to other final status issues. And here we see movement at various levels within our own governments, but also in the international community, to think again about what is the paradigm of the peace process. Why do we need to stick to an all or nothing? Either we agree on all issues and if we don't agree on all issues, we don't move forward. Well, the climate crisis cannot allow us to keep that paradigm in place. And it's very important for the international community to lead here and help our governments resolve this issue and be a concrete path towards also advancing the two-state solution, and to stop seeing raw sewage flowing across our various watersheds as we see today. The third chapter, and just very briefly, also mentioned by earlier speakers, the need to create green jobs. We are blessed with an incredible valley, with a river that's holy to half of humanity. Yet, sadly, as you see in the photo to the left, the Jordan River today looks more like a sewage canal than the mighty Jordan that used to flow in this region, with implications also on the Dead Sea. Well, the climate crisis also presents the opportunity, because of desalination, to invest in green jobs through climate-smart agriculture, an issue that here too, Israel is a world leader. Through cooperation, we can turn the Jordan Valley back into a sustainable breadbasket of shared prosperity by rehabilitating the river. Instead of using canals and dams, we must use the natural river itself as the water source of our region, to be supplied from the river rather than from man-made resources. And if we do that, we can see a healthy river that, instead of attracting only 1 million, mostly Christian pilgrims every year, can attract tens of millions and help us move from a economy in the valley at the moment of abject poverty of only $4 billion US. And here we completed a master plan that shows that we can move to an economy of $73 billion if we can work together. And finally, the last chapter of the Green Blue Deal is all about education, and that's a strong focus also of the European Green Deal. We have, over the last 26 years, created educational activities. These are youth water trustees, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli, learning about my water reality, my neighbor's water reality, and how they're interconnected, particularly as we face the climate crisis. These are mayors, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Israeli, jumping into a clean stretch of the Jordan River, not because they're best friends. They know that they're going to be condemned the next day after jumping in this river together, but they stand tall and show leadership, perhaps much more than we're seeing from our national governments, because they have come to understand that at the moment they're losers. They're all losers. Their communities are losing opportunities, are living in relative poverty, and they refuse that, and they understand that cooperation is essential to rehabilitate the Jordan River, to meet the challenges of climate change. And then just very finally, we indeed have had the opportunity to present these ideas at the invitation of the then German president of the Security Council, where Nada Majdelani, the Palestinian director, Yana Abu Talib, the Jordanian director, and myself had the opportunity to present this. And a year later, at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, the Foreign Minister of Finland, Mr. Pekka Haavisto, has again shown leadership and taken championship of this issue, speaking to the Israeli Foreign Minister on this issue, the Palestinian Foreign Minister, the Jordanian, Egyptian and Emirati, and seeing that there is a willingness to move forward. My final word that I think we can all benefit from, while there are corners of the globe in the political sphere where climate denial is prevalent, that's not the case in the Middle East. When you look at the water authorities, Palestinian, Jordanian and Israeli, there is consensus that climate change is real. Climate change is a threat to the water security. We need, through events like these, to make sure that decision makers come to understand that there's an opportunity to move from a threat multiplier to a multiplier of opportunities to really lead to climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate resilience, and be an entry point to help advance the type of two-state solution that we think is essential for our region. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Gideon, thank you for sharing with us your comprehensive work, also emphasizing the double win, how regional cooperation can both help tackle the climate crisis, but also create new bonds and spheres for cooperation and engagement between Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians. And I would say more than that, looking all the way to Morocco and to the Gulf, but also showing the power of civil society in advocating ideas on the global stage and in important diplomatic forums. Very natural move to Ambassador Gideon Bechar from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the Special Envoy for Climate and Sustainability, someone who has led the issue of tackling climate change from within the ministry, and I think has moved the system to a place in which Israel has a special envoy for this topic, in which when the Israeli Prime Minister speaks at the Leaders' Summit of the Biden convened, speaks very highly about Israel's commitment to change policies. And even if we look at the election platform of the new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, we see how much emphasis there is over there on tackling climate change and becoming this a priority for Israel. So Gideon was previously an ambassador in Senegal who headed the department within the foreign ministry to combat anti-Semitism, who also served in Tunisia when Israel has a diplomatic mission there back in the 90s as a result of the peace process. Thank you for being with us and sharing with us what the foreign ministry is doing today to tackle climate change and how it could be more effective moving forward.
Thank you very much, תודה רבה, Nimrod, and thank you very much for the organizers for organizing this event. I think that it is a very timely event and a very important one. And my wish is to see more debates and more webinars, seminars, and events like that, because we really have to give this issue a priority in our activity, in our actions, and in our awareness. I want to start with my main message. My main message is that regional cooperation on climate change is a necessity. And it is a necessity because we need to minimize risks, and the risks are catastrophic for our region, for the Middle East, but also to maximize opportunities which are huge also in this region. And adding to that, I want to say that the countries in the region cannot cope alone with climate change and its challenges, and we need really to see more cooperation from the international community, namely the European Union, United States, and other major players. So these are my two main messages. We need to cooperate, and we need regional cooperation, but also international involvement in that. This is my main point. Now, we see some regional cooperation, and I want to cite the regional cooperation of Cyprus for the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East for climate change. which is a wonderful initiative, and we support it fully. The corona a little bit created a setback in the implementation of this cooperation of this program, but we see now that when things are taking a turn to the better, that also this initiative is returning. We support it with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Environmental Protection in Israel, just to say that there are working groups of scientists from different countries in the region, either Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Jordan, and others, who already cooperate on issues of climate change according to thematic working groups. We see also more and more cooperation with the countries of the Abraham Accords. It is indeed essential for them regarding the development of renewable energies, food security, water, energy, agriculture, etc. There is a mutual interest both in Israel and in these countries to go ahead in this direction. It was mentioned before by the previous speakers that the Middle East is considered a climate hotspot. And I just want to add a few more data on what was said. One, that the acceleration of the global warming in the Middle East is 1.5 times more than the world average. Whereas world average temperature rose about 1.1 degrees Celsius, in the Middle East it is about 1.4, 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have already reached the lowest threshold of the Paris Accord to try to limit world temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So here it is already happening in the Middle East. And if we look at the Syrian desert, in Iraq, in Iran, we see that in some summer days, temperature is already above 50 degrees Celsius. It can be 51 or 52 degrees Celsius. These are conditions which are making livelihood impossible. Toward the middle of the century, there will be 20 or more days where the average temperature will be more than 50 degrees Celsius with devastating effects in the Gulf and in the Middle East in general. Another aspect which is very important is that water temperature has risen also dramatically, and the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea is the warmest part already of the Mediterranean. Water warming is accelerated here, and it is recorded to be already 3 degrees Celsius. Also, sea level rise in the eastern Mediterranean is the highest in the Mediterranean Sea, today about 4 millimeters per year and accelerating. So the need is urgent for cooperation. Now, we believe that no country in the region can cope with devastating effects of climate change without cooperation. We all need one another. I mean, and even if one country is doing better and is doing good because of some circumstances, it will be affected dramatically, but by the events in other countries that won't be able to cope with the climate crisis. And scientists are telling us to be worried about refugees in big numbers in the Middle East, but also coming from Africa and other regions. So the Middle East is also prone to this stability coming from also human factors. We have to take into consideration that the transition, global transition from fossil fuels into renewable energies will have also effects on oil and gas exporting countries in the Middle East. and alternatives must be developed today. And we see in that also a big place of cooperation between Israel and its neighbors, and generally speaking, in the Middle East. It was mentioned also before by previous speakers that the potential in technologies is huge. Of course, food security, alternative proteins, water, not only water desalinization, this is something that everyone goes automatically to, but water purification is very much needed in the region, and can supply, can be an additional supply of water for agriculture. Renewable energy, energy storage, energy efficiency, all of these are things that can be done in regional cooperation. Alternative proteins will increase food security in the Middle East. The Middle East is dependent on importation of food outside the region, and we saw it during the first weeks of the corona, how the international food supply chains were negatively affected, and the Middle East must, really it's a must, increase its capacity to produce food. And we can do it together, and we see that as a huge area of possibilities. I want to relate to what was mentioned before by Roy, my dear friend, about the activities in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I want to say that we have increased dramatically our involvement in the field of climate change. And you can see me here speaking as Special Envoy for Climate Change and Sustainability. But not only that, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Gabi Ashkenazi, has instructed us to deal climate change as an area of priority for us and the ministry. A special team for climate change and international agenda was formed to deal with that, and it is working in parallel with my activity as a special envoy for climate change and sustainability. So for us, climate change at the ministry is an area of a higher priority like other priority areas. I just want to mention, for instance, our activities during International Environment Day on the 22nd of April, where we have instructed all our diplomatic missions in the world to carry out activities to encourage the awareness to the situation of the environment in the world. And many activities were carried out in more than 86 of our missions, either consulates or embassies. All by all, I think that I will not be mistaken if I would say that there were about 500 different activities carried out worldwide by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I do not know if any other ministry in the world has done something similar, and we are working on that. We are also working on the introduction of a green standard to our diplomatic missions abroad. They will be measured by their ability to reduce their ecological footprint, either by reducing energy consumption, water, moving into more public transport, etc., and carrying out activities regarding climate change and sustainability in the countries where they are located. So I want to conclude by saying that climate change, of course, can be either a source of tension and conflict in the Middle East, or other a source of cooperation. And it's up to us to overcome all the political obstacles and all other obstacles, and really to move forward. And Israel is ready to cooperate with everyone in the region on the issues of climate change, sustainability, and the environment. Thank you.
Ambassador Bachar, thank you, and thank you for sharing with us the transformation that the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs is undergoing on this topic. And for one country that is becoming increasingly committed to the issue, we're turning to a country that is a leader on the global stage in dealing with an environmental issue. And we have with us Dr. Ambassador Suzanne Bassum-Reiner, the ambassador of Germany to Israel, previously the ambassador of Germany to Rome and to Paris. And definitely Germany is a country that is contributing significantly, both within the European Union, to the EU Green Deal and policies that Brussels is leading, but also on the national level, whether in the investments in renewable and financial investment and solidarity with developing countries that are doing their first steps on that path. So Ambassador, we are very glad to have you with us. Just perhaps as a framing, we remember the president of the EU Commission, von der Leyen, saying that Europe can become the continent of climate adaptation. That's something she said very recently, and we'll be glad to hear about the policies that Germany is leading within the context of the EU border goals. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our partners and friends at Mitvim, EcoPeace, and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for the invitation to today's conference. My task today is, as you said, to briefly kind of recall the position of my government on the topic. I welcome this conference personally because it is dedicated to what we in Germany would define as the issue of the 21st century, the climate crisis. Climate change will shift key coordinates of foreign policy, that is for sure. Already now, climate policy is more than just environmental policy. It has long since arrived at the very, very center of foreign policy. For Germany, it is absolutely clear that we need a full-fledged climate diplomacy. And it was amazing to hear that among all speakers of your event today, there seems to be a consensus on that, a consensus on the urgency, necessity, but also feasibility of an honest, full-fledged climate diplomacy. There is not yet some kind of universal understanding or definition of what climate diplomacy would be. But the European Commission, as one of the forerunners of this, of what this would be, has identified, let's say, 4 strands of climate diplomacy at the political level, 4 packages, and these 4 elements are committing to multilateralism in climate policy, particularly to the Paris Agreement. Second, addressing the implications of climate change on peace and security. Third, acceleration of domestic action on all levels and raising global ambition. And fourth, enhancing international climate cooperation through advocacy and outreach. I would just limit myself to the first 2 aspects, and I'm very glad or happy having understand through Ambassador Dan Shapiro's statement that the consensus also on these 4 elements is also shared by the new US administration. So on the first elements I wanted to talk about, committing to multilateralism and implementing the Paris Agreement. It's, I think, necessary to say that much like the current pandemic, climate change is a global phenomenon that requires a global response. And we have seen in the global reaction on the pandemic how, what is possible, how it is possible. Global transportation was put to a halt for a moment, global economy reduced for a moment, the fight against the propagation of the virus became worldwide a first priority. This is what we need with regard to climate change. We need to counter declining faith in multilateral institutions and make global collaboration work. The negotiation and signature of the Paris Agreement on climate change by 196 states demonstrated that achievements are possible. It is paramount to both strengthen the capacities of international and regional organizations and establish coalitions of the willing that are able and willing to lead the way. Given their economic and political weight in the world, it is, as you said, the European Union and its member states like Germany that have a particularly important role to play. We are convinced that Europe needs to lead by example by setting standards for sustainable growth across global value chains. The EU has always been at the forefront of the multilateral climate diplomacy and is strongly committed to implementing the Paris Agreement. The European Green Deal is the new European growth strategy to transform the Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. I would like to repeat, the Green Deal is a growth strategy. It's not the contrary. The EU wants to be climate neutral by 2050, or all the while boosting the economy through green technology and the creation of sustainable industry. We see Israel as a very strong partner in this endeavor. We see the high responsibility of Israel as a powerful high-tech country to be part of this multilateral endeavor. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas spoke this year at the virtual event of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Earth Day, and he underlined that Germany and the EU can and should draw on Israel innovation to advance the Green Deal. The EU's Horizon 2020 Innovation Incentive Program will devote at least 35% of its budget to investments in climate solutions, including through multinational partnerships. Israel has already long ago in the past pioneered smart agricultural solutions such as drip irrigation, and there are many more very promising projects. I want to mention, for example, just one example, the E4Fuel project, which received 4.1 million euros in EU funding. The initiative has brought together a number of research institutions, including Germany's Max Planck Institute of Molecular Plant Biology and the Weizmann Institute of Science, in a bid to transform carbon dioxide, one of the primary greenhouse gases, into renewable energy. Let me speak about the second aspect of the EU Commission's 4 strands of climate diplomacy at the political level, that is, addressing implications of climate change on peace and security. The security policy dimension of climate change is already increasingly significant. Therefore, Germany has set itself the goal of anchoring the climate security nexus in the UN, in the EU context, and in other international forums. Climate, as other issues of military security, is in the heart of security policy, and this has to be understood by all the countries doing international security policy. We used our time as non-permanent member of the UN Security Council to put the issue of climate and security on the agenda. We want to ensure that the Security Council addresses the impact of climate change for peace and security worldwide on a regular basis and in a systematic manner. Thank you very much, Gideon, for mentioning our joint effort there. In July 2020, Germany, together with 9 other Security Council member states, organized a high-level debate on climate change and security. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas announced the creation of an informal expert group on climate-related risks to peace and security as a venue to discuss the operational challenges arising from climate-related security. To improve awareness, we need better information on climate-related security risk. To facilitate this, we launched a global climate security risk and foresight assessment. And although the climate crisis is often a threat multiplier, it can equally be seen as an opportunity to work together to address climate change. And here again, as it was said already by some of the speakers before me, Israel is and must be a strong partner. In the Middle East, climate change may fuel violent competition over diminishing resources. My colleague of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just underlined it. but especially here it provides a big chance to work for sustainable and peaceful regional solutions. Israel can play an important role in the nexus of natural gas, electricity, and water, which involves Egypt and Jordan, as well as the West Bank and Gaza. The Middle East Green-Blue Deal, presented by EcoPeace, puts an emphasis. It provides various recommendations for very much needed cooperation. Now more than ever, we are looking for opportunities to strengthen the cooperation between Israel and Jordan and between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. There is a lot that can be done. For example, using the Israeli-Palestinian Joint Water Committee to discuss water demands and deliver very concrete results for the people. Gideon was very explicit on that. Or why not work together with Jordan on cross-border infrastructure for renewable energy? I'm fully aware that this is not easy, but I'm convinced that regarding climate change, we need to think out of the box, to take bold steps and seek cooperation wherever it is possible, just like we did after we realized the possible consequences of the outbreak of the COVID pandemic worldwide. So if Germany climate diplomacy can contribute to it, we are more than happy to do it, and we count on Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, also for emphasizing the importance of multilateralism. And we remember the initiative by France and Germany in forming the Alliance for Multilateralism that also deals with such issues, and your emphasis on relations between Israel and Jordan and the Palestinians, which are critical relations that we at Mitvim are working to improve as much as possible. We will take a few minutes for a question and answer session. We ran almost over time, but it's such a fascinating topic that it would be a shame to spread away without giving the floor to some of the questions raised by the audience. So I'll mention just a few of the questions that was raised in the chat, and I'll give speakers an opportunity to relate to any of those questions that you want to quite shortly, so we'll close and wrap up within about 10 minutes, if possible. And I apologize, some of the speakers had to rush to previous commitments already. So one question maybe to Ambassador Rogan is, if you look at other conflict zones around the world, do you see climate change and the climate crisis as incentives, igniters of cooperation and work towards conflict resolution? Are there any examples that we can learn from as we strive to improve our relations with our neighbors? Other questions were related to the Israeli policies and whether Israel is living up to its commitments on climate, and if so, if not, how could it be convinced to fulfill its commitments on the global and regional stage? There was also a question maybe for you, Gideon, about the Jordan River and whether it's realistic to aspire for the rehabilitation of the river while Palestinians do not have equal access to it. Or, generally speaking, how could you do Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian regional cooperation on environment given the current situation of the Palestinians and perhaps also their willingness or unwillingness to cooperate with Israel? The Abraham Accords were mentioned several times during the first part of the debate, and we didn't have the Emirati speaker with us, but if anyone wants to relate how the Abraham Accords could be serving as a potential for improved work to tackle the climate crisis or to foster regional cooperation around that, that will be, I think, an important thing to say. And finally, there was a question about the idea of a shipment pathway through Eilat, and what does that mean for preservation of all kind of environmental assets that are there. So those are the questions that we'll try to relate to. And again, we'll go among the speakers that are still with us. You can choose what question to answer. Do it rather briefly. And Gideon, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Nimrod. So I'll take on more than one. First of all, as far as Israel living up to its commitments, and I'll combine that with the deal between the Emirates and an Israeli government company to bring crude oil to Eilat and utilize a pipeline that exists from Eilat to Ashkelon in order to move crude oil to Europe. We're extremely concerned, and we think that's a bad example, that project should not be moving forward. The coral reefs of the Gulf of Aqaba on the Israeli side, Eilat side, Aqaba side, and Saudi and Egyptian coasts are a unique coral reef that has proven to be resilient to the changes brought about by climate change. While we see tremendous death of coral reefs so tragically throughout the world, the Great Barrier Reef is dying. The coral reefs of the Gulf of Aqaba have a unique ability for resilience. We must not allow up to 120 tankers that are proposed to come in annually to the port of Eilat to be the demise of not only these reefs for our own region, but for the ability to learn from these reefs to sustain reefs around the world. In relation to the Jordan River, one of the strengths of working on water issues is that water is fungible. Now, we can come to an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians on water issues without necessarily having to agree on borders or the other final status issues. Exactly where the water comes from is not the key issue related to obtaining water rights. And we see that in the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, where Jordan accesses its fair share of the Jordan River, not from the river itself, but from Israel, from the Sea of Galilee. So there are arrangements that can be made that enable us to move forward on water today without having to agree on all other final status issues. But on the contrary, we believe that by coming and solving one of the final status issues, we can start build trust. We can start to show the public that we have a partner to peace, and that if we can reach an agreement on one issue, then why can't we also agree on other issues? So the climate crisis and the need to build resilience on water issues, particularly in the Palestinian and Jordanian areas, helps us move forward. Finally, on the Abraham Accords, I don't think we have a better example of how we can integrate our economies in a sustainable way. We see some very important investments taking place throughout the Gulf, a renewed commitment to renewables from the East, and we see the proposals to connect grids from Israel to Cyprus and to Greece on the European continent. This creates a new channel of sustainability where renewable energy can move not only from connecting the grids of Israel with our neighbors to the east, but we can move renewable energy to meet the needs of Europe, not only through harnessing the sun and the sea, but the exciting development of green hydrogen can turn pipelines that are also being proposed to link Israel with the European continent, to move green hydrogen there as well. So I think, as several of the ambassadors have highlighted, we indeed can play an essential role. We hope that the G7 will indeed continue to show leadership in these issues, and we see Glasgow as a real opportunity to put some of these issues on center stage. We're optimistic, perhaps we're over-hopeful that we can even see an event organized and a potential signing ceremony with the private sector, with our own governments on issues such as the water energy nexus, to really highlight to the rest of the world the commitment that this region can bring for sustainability and for climate resilience.
תודה גדעון. רועי, please. Ambassador Hogan.
Yeah, so one of the questions touched on whether or not conflict areas are actually being able to address climate in a more sustainable way. And actually, I think it's very, very difficult to imagine that, because as we all know, making climate transitions or addressing climate impact is quite expensive, and it's not something that you can just do in isolation. It has to be done in a coordinated way, whether it's across government or vertically, if you like, right down to district and community levels. So there are specific, really big challenges when you're in the middle of conflict, and you also have to think about the issues. When you look at the places around the world, for example, where the UN has a peacekeeping mission, or there is a political mission, or some other mission, the African Union, for example, or in the African continent, you see that very often those missions addressing conflict have actually taken place in locations which are the most vulnerable and the least resilient to climate. So even though some of those climate drivers for root causes of conflict may not have been the sole reason that those communities have fallen into that terrible circumstance, the fact is that the impact of all of that is exacerbated by conflict, and the inability to deal with the consequences of conflict as much as the consequences of climate lead the humanitarian circumstances in those places to be even greater. So when we think internationally about addressing climate change and helping vulnerable communities to address climate change, we have to do that in a way that helps people to build back better, whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about early resilience and building back from conflict. And I think, I think as we try to do those things in conflict affected places, we, as the international community, try to build in climate resilience, because it doesn't make sense not to. When you're starting from scratch, you have to try and do that. But it's very, very difficult. It's very challenging, and it's certainly not something that the communities who are afflicted by conflict can do themselves. So those I would say are the very, very extreme of conflict impact, where we have I think a particular responsibility as the international community and as international actors to think about the consequences on the populations. Because frankly, if we don't, dealing with the consequences and paying for the consequences and the humanitarian elements of this are far more expensive than trying to tackle the root causes before it happens.
Thank you. Roy, would you like to add something?
Yes, אני אגיד רק כמה דברים. א', שהאופטימיות של גדעון וגיל היא במקום, כי זאת המדיניות שלנו. זאת אומרת, האופטימיות זה לא רגש, אלא מדיניות, והיא מחייבת אותנו ומובילה אותנו לפעולה. אז אנחנו לא מרימים ידיים אל מול האתגרים, אלא מחפשים את ההזדמנויות, ויש הרבה הזדמנויות כפי שהוצגו כאן. יש הרבה הזדמנויות, כי גם יש הרבה שינויים פוליטיים, שמאפשרים לנו לנצל את ההזדמנויות עכשיו. יש שינוי בממשל האמריקאי, יש שינוי בפוליטיקה האזורית, ואולי, כמו שאומרים בספרדית אוכלה, גם שינוי בפוליטיקה הישראלית. שיאפשרו לנו, בעצם ייתנו לנו, מניחים בפנינו תנאים טובים יותר, להמשיך ולקדם את התביעות הפוליטיות שלנו, להתמודדות טובה יותר עם משבר האקלים, ולמצוא את ההזדמנויות ולנצל את ההזדמנויות. אז יש הזדמנויות מצוינות לשיתופי פעולה, להיות תלויים לא זה ליד זה, אלא אחד בשני, זה בזה. אנחנו תלויים אחד בשני ותלויים בעבודה המשותפת, במולטילטרליות, ומכאן אנחנו יכולים רק להמשיך ולפעול ביחד, כי כל הריבועים האלו, גם בקהל וגם מי שנמצאים כאן, יש לנו תפקיד בשגרור הידע, בהצעת תוכניות, בעיצוב המדיניות, ואנחנו נהיה גם שם וגם בסקוטלנד לקראת סוף השנה.
Thank you. And with this optimistic note, we are wrapping up this event. Definitely not the last event that Mitvim, EcoPeace, and FES will do together on these issues, and we'll continue to work to explore how climate change is becoming increasingly a foreign policy issue and how we can foster regional cooperation and maybe even peace. So thank you to the speakers, thank you to the audience, thank you to our partners, and be in touch, and we'll see you next time.